My guest today is Ray Sanders.
We're talking about the Surface Stations project, which is a way I review weather stations for Tall Blokes Talk Shop. And I understand you've had my governor on, Roger Tatzel, before. And you've also had Ned Nikolov as well, I believe, who both, well, obviously Roger is the governor and Ned also contributes to it as well. So what I do is I review weather stations for whether their readings are good enough to contribute to the historic temperature record, which is a contentious point. Many of them are not very good. There's a standard which was set up rather by the Commission for Instruments and Meteorological Observations, which is known as CIMO, C-I-M-O. And they have regulations and they state what standards a weather station should meet. Simple as that. They have 5 classifications, classes 1 to 5. Class 1 and 2 are very good ones, representative of a wide area, and should be considered accurate. Class 3 comes in as a little bit iffy, and it may not exactly represent the wider area. Class 3 has an error margin plus or minus 1 degree Celsius. Whenever I say degrees, I mean Celsius, not Fahrenheit. Class 4 is further compromised, meaning that its figures are plus or minus 2 degrees. Class 5 has no regulation standard at all and could be inaccurate to plus or minus 5 degrees. It's important that people understand what this actually means. The instrumentation itself will be very accurate. It will be to the 10th of a degree Celsius, giving you what the temperature is, where it is sited. The best analogy I can give is your kitchen, where you have an oven. Now, you may set your oven to 200 degrees centigrade, put a thermometer in there, it will read 200 degrees centigrade. The thermometer in your kitchen may only be 20 degrees. The point is, they'll both be accurate. The one in the oven is telling you what that particular area is. The one in the kitchen is giving the wider view. One in your garden may be saying 15. Same difference. They're representing different scales of area. And this is what CIMO is intended to do. It's intended to codify internationally what temperatures were. Basically, to get class 1, you need to have a pristine site with about 100-meter radius of nothing compromising it, which might be buildings, it might be shade, could be anything that's artificial, not natural. Class 2, the radius reduces down to about 30 meters, and you mustn't have more than a certain percent. Class 3, so on, down to class 4, where it's only 3 meters, 10 feet, nothing really. Beyond that point, class 5 could be anywhere you like, because all the regulations state is not meeting class 4. Okay, so it's pretty much as simple as that. Now, there's about 384 weather stations in the UK. 13% of them meet classes 1 and 2. That's it. 87% of them are not very good. 8% are in class 3. 49%, almost half, are in class 4, which is that's 187 of the damn things. Quite an error margin. And finally, 112 stations are actually class 5. If you think that's bad, it actually gets worse, because there's 102 stations that don't even exist. Now, that's quite mind-blowing when you think about it. I need to get the point across that the UK Met Office was formerly part of the Ministry of Defence, a government department. It's now technically a government agency and it can raise its own funds. But it was part of the Ministry of Defence. It was a very, very secretive organisation. Trying to get information out of them is like getting blood out of a stone. CIMO regulations, which were set up by the World Meteorological Organization and the International Standards Organization, should be readily available information, you would think, because there's nothing security about it. But I had to go to a Freedom of Information request. the whole procedure takes ages just to get those details from them. Why, I don't know. When I started to investigate where stations were, I discovered that there was pages giving me climate averages for particular sites. And the site was known as the Met Office Climate Averages Locations. That's how it was named. When I started to look at them, I thought, well, I don't know where the hell that is. So I actually got in my car to go out and have a look through some of them, because I knew in the area that I live, I knew, for instance, place where I've worked quite a lot, Dungeness. There's a nuclear power station there, so it's quite a known place. Couldn't find it. There's a couple of other places near me, Folkestone, Dover. I went to those, couldn't find them. Which, considering I only tried to find 3, and I couldn't find any of them, and I'm not an idiot, I do know how to look up coordinates on a map, and they actually handily, the Met Office do actually give you GPS coordinates effectively, so you can find the things. They weren't there. This led to quite a rigmarole of freedom of information requests, and then a challenge to the freedom of information requests, because they wouldn't tell me everything I wanted to know. They hid behind a few weasel words and various things. And so they sent me a list of these 302 supposed climate average stations, and 102 of them, they had to admit by saying closed, open, closed, whether it was closed or open, that they didn't actually exist. Now, that's kind of mind-blowing. That's very strange that you would continue to attribute figures and averages to the second decimal place to places that don't exist, especially when you, by the way, second decimal place, and you're only measuring it to the first decimal place. That's kind of freaky. But what, I guess the kind of, how can I put it, the weirdest thing is if I told you that some of those stations died over half a century ago. There's one called Manby. It closed in 1974. I was 18. Half the world's most of the world's population hadn't been born, were born subsequent to that. It's just so incredibly old. Why can't it die? I then discovered that these climate averages were made up of cell blocks. This is probably old hat to people like you, but I didn't know any of this at the time. And what they do is they don't give you figures for an individual site. They homogenize them all up with ones in the local area, okay? So you may look up a climate average for a particular location. It may not even give you that site, even though there is one there, but it will give you a group of ones around it. And then the numbers are all added together and averaged out to give a sort of a general impression of the temperature rather than the temperature. But this becomes so incredibly bizarre because some of these cells, none of the stations exist. Not at all. One of the reviews I did, excuse me, was about a place called Skål. It only opened, I think, in 1971, and it closed in 1979. It was slightly less than 8 years. And they managed to derive averages, 30-year rolling averages from 1960, before it was even in existence, and they're still doing it. So you can get 1960, 1990, 70 to 2000, 80 to 2000, 2020. Even though it was only around for 8 years, it was kind of weird. But looking it up, and I've put it on there in the print, I found there was a thing called the Skål experiment, which was quite amusing in as much as this was also in the same village where this workstation was. Some clairvoyance, I suppose is the best word, done seances to prove life after death. And it was called the Skål experiment. And I just thought it was so apt because this weather station will not die. It finished in 1979. It's still going, for God's sakes. It's really kind of weird. Going back to the stations that do exist, that need reviewing, if I can get this up on the screen, I'd like to give you some examples of, excuse me, the ridiculous sites that some of them appear in. You can see that book. I don't know if it's coming up. It's called The Victorian Kitchen Garden.
Yep.
Now, way back in the Victorian era, Queen Victoria, 150, say, years ago, the lords and lairds of this country had big houses and they built specific kitchen gardens in them. which big line of poplar trees all around, break all the wind. And then they would have a rectangle garden with solid brick walls that were up to 14 feet high. So these are massive constructions. The idea was to modify the climate quite considerably. The claim was that the south-facing wall of a Victorian wall kitchen garden in, say, Scotland would have roughly the same climate as 1,000 miles further south in the south of France. It was a deliberate intent to create an artificial microclimate, which didn't get any frost. So it was deliberately designed to keep the places warm at night and enhance the daytime temperatures so they could have pineapples on their Christmas tale of the entertaining the lords and ladies and all the rest of it. Those sort of people were benefactors of science and the arts, and they often had observatories or weather stations on their site, so they needed to know the weather. So you've got this artificial microclimate. Where would any meteorologist say, do not, under any circumstances, put a weather station to record the natural weather of the country? Well, unfortunately, I haven't gone through all of the weather stations yet. I'm only about halfway through the project. I've done reviews of about 190, I think, something like that. But I'm confident that at least 10%, 1 in 10, and probably 15% are actually in walled gardens. I mean, they're complete, utter junk. It just baffles me that a meteorologist would do that. However, in 2022, 19th of July, we had a typical British summer, 2 hot days and a thunderstorm. It was very hot, though. And allegedly, the records were set. There was a meteorologist working for Scottish television who was proudly announcing that the record was broken in Floors Castle. That's Floors, Floors Castle, which is just north of the border into Scotland. It's in a walled garden. And this is a professional meteorologist putting it out on the news that this walled garden has broken the record. It temporarily was given that right, but then they realized, well, this is a bit publicly available because it's a tourist attraction. People can go up and see it. We couldn't have that. So they gave it to another place, Charter Hall, which is a former RAF base, Air Force base, though it's not in use anymore. And that one's even worse, by the way, but I haven't got to review that one yet. So they were actually happy to give a national record in a walled garden. You might think that's crazy, but it wasn't the first time they'd done it. In 2019, the Cambridge University Botanic Gardens were given the UK national record, even though in 1931, the keepers of the Central England temperature record, the world's longest running temperature series, had ruled the site as unacceptable on the grounds of UHI, urban heat island effect, in 1931, nearly 100 years ago. And the UK population has tripled, the Cambridge population has tripled in that time. And of course, there's an awful lot of cars, aircon on the buildings. The whole site's been massively built up. It's a cauldron in there, and they still awarded the record to it. So walled gardens, absolute no-no, dozens of them. And there's probably 40 or 50 of them, of that 384. It's absolutely a no-no. Moving on. The internal combustion engine doesn't really go well with taking meter reads. You will not believe how many car parks have weather stations. I personally, some time ago, before I started this project, actually pulled up to meet a colleague on business at Langdon Bay, which is near Dover and southeast of England. And we both parked. We were reverse parked in with our exhausts, 6 feet from the Stevenson screen that was taking the temperatures. There's a car park, and it's there. This is quite common. Crosby Coast Guard Station, Bridlington Coast Guard Station, you name it. They've got car parks there, and they've got weather stations, Stevenson screens. There's a place in North Wales called Prestatyn, and it's actually on the corner of the road where you drive in, where you have to get this barrier to get into entry into the car park. So right next to where you're stopping, and people are coming and going endlessly all day off a very busy road, but a weather station. It's crazy, Lots and lots of them are like that. Now, you think that sounds daft, and it probably is, but I'll give you two particular ones. Talking of records, there's a place called Motherwell Strathclyde Park, which again, the Met Office wanted to give it the Scottish national record, I think about 2020. Until somebody pointed out that the ice cream van had been parked there for about 10 hours all day and it was his engine running, and they had to annul it. Because if you're going to put it by a car park, somebody will park there. You know, it's kind of the way of the world. There's also another one called Nettlecombe, which is in Somerset, which is in the southwest of England. And it's owned by a company called, it's run by an organisation called the Field Studies Council, which is an educational unit. But they park their, what we call them minibuses, like 12-seater coaches. They park them right next to the screen. These are the people who are taking the meter readings are actually parking next to the screen, and nobody seems to care. It's, well, it's crackers. Now, moving on then, I'll give you another example, some more, and this one's really topical. I don't know if you will have heard about Heathrow Airport closing last week because of a fire in the substation. Substations handle a lot of power. There's a substation near me that's got 4 interconnectors from France that come into it, because I live in the southeast of England. So you've got, and that's 5 gigawatts, 5 billion watts of power going into this, going through this place at any given time. Transformers are generally about 99% efficient. But of course, 1 in 100, you're only knocking 2 noughts off the end, aren't you? So much heat is actually dissipated from electricity transformers that companies, electricity supply and energy supply companies, are thinking of connecting them to district heating systems and running 600, 700, 800 houses off them. That's how much is being lost. You wouldn't want to put a weather station right bang next to one. The Met Office does it quite a lot. I actually, there's one in particular called Bingley. It's in the north of England. It's next to Bradford West substation. It's quite a big one. And I queried it with the Met Office, and I said, do you not really think that he's got to go somewhere? Now, most of the time, it'll be going vertically upwards, doing nothing or whatever. But of course, if you've got a temperature inversion, it'll be holding it down to the ground or a slight breeze. And it's literally a matter of meters away from transformers. And they put it there, it's whatever. Well, I said, it's okay because it's 3 meters. It's more than 3 meters away, so it doesn't matter. There's no, because they've got like this tape measure idea in their head that this is what CMO regulations are meant to be about, they will say, okay, it's more than 3 meters. That's what they actually said to me. It's more than 3 meters. It's okay. You can look at it. Bingley. Similar thing, there's a place called Amersham. Exactly the same. Right next to the things. Even in one of the better quality rated ones near Cambridge, which is an agricultural research centre, it's been recently moved, and it's been moved quite a bit closer to the Histon substation. It almost seems like they've thought, because the one in Bingley, for instance, didn't used to be there. It's called Bingley number 2. There was originally a Bingley number 1 somewhere else, and they moved it there after the substation was built. It wasn't the case the reverse way round. So I suppose it's handy for an electricity supply for the instruments, but really it's not, the best of things. Talking about electricity, one thing you wouldn't want to do is build a solar farm around a weather station. If you go to look at my report on Chertsey Abbey Meads, it's a water pumping station. They didn't have the decency to even move the weather station. They just built them all around it. So it's like in the middle of an island. Now, on the article there, I did link to, there is serious research about that as well, that solar farms do create their own UHI, their own urban heat island effect, because they're holding it in. Also, they get warm when they're actually working, but they hold it in overnight. So it will affect the temperature. And again, the Met Office said, well, it doesn't matter because it's more than this distance away. You can't quite touch them, sort of thing, but that's okay. However, it's quite common. That was one extreme I did because I couldn't believe they could actually just build it round it. Normally they go up to it or something, but a lot of them do have solar farms. There's a military program called Project Prometheus, where on RAF bases and places like that, they are deliberately building solar panels for the military facilities. Okay, I'll go through this one. There's actually a place called Leconfield, which it's in Yorkshire, and it has the weather stations has had the solar panels built very, very, very close by it, obviously degrading the site. But a lot of the data that comes out of these weather stations isn't just used by the Met Office. Some of it gets used by a department that is laughably called the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. Okay. This department, the Met Office supply this department with the weather readings from 17, that's an important number, 17 of their weather stations, okay, to produce an average for heating, a figure that they use for what they call heating days. So they take they get this figure from 17 stations and they divide an average. But how do you divide an average of 17 stations? You add up the numbers and you divide by 17, you guess. No, you take 13 of them, yeah. The other 4, you double the number. Yeah. Double the 4, get 8, add the 13, 21, and divide by 21. Now, you can't believe that, can you? If you go to my report of Leconfield, you'll see in there how they do it and how they work it out. But they literally use 17, but double count 4 of them, which, well, Leconfield is one, Herne is another, Boscombe Down, I think Heathrow. They just simply double the figure, add them to the other 13, divide by 21. Madness, but that's how they do it.
Is there an explanation as to why they would do that?
Who knows? That's not the Met Office doing it. That's the as I say, the Department of Energy, which is notorious at the moment. But let's not go there. So we have that. So we've got car parks, CL substations, solar farms. Another good thing is sewage farms. What else can you say about them? It's got to go somewhere, but water treatment works and sewage disposal works. Obviously, they always had rain gauges because there's tens of thousands of rain gauges around the country. Hydrology is quite important, apparently. They also have been equipped with weather stations, stevens and screens. But in the most bizarre situations, you'll actually get sewage settlement tanks giving out an awful lot of heat, and they will have weather stations right alongside them. It really is. That's common. It's good ones to look at there would be Ivor Waterworks, which is actually near Heathrow. You can barely, and Keswick, which is one up in the north of England. You can barely see the weather station because it's in such close proximity to these massive tanks that are treating raw sewage, basically, or whatever. Not a good idea. Now, I'll go on to the next one, which if you look up, anybody wants to look up at my report on Battersea, which is Battersea, Battersea. It's really is very close to the centre of London. London is reported as having a +5 degree urban heat island, which is apparently not as extreme as some places because we have quite a lot of parkland in London. It's not as dense as, say, Paris or some other cities are. But you've got a weather station by the river in Battersea, Heliport. It's actually on an artificial plinth for the heliport so that the pilots know where the hell they're going, what's going on, what the weather conditions are. I couldn't actually get a really good shot of the weather station to put on the report. So I instead got the camera sort of like Street View, turned it round so you could just see the massive high rise because this is in all around this weather station on a heliport. Heliports are quite common places for some reason. Again, it might be something to do with Coast Guard's air sea rescue, that sort of thing. But lots and lots of heliports have weather stations. Donnanook is a classic one. And the one that I went to, actually, Langdon Bay, when I was there, when we were heating up the Stevenson screen with our car exhausts, big air sea rescue helicopter came and landed on the heliport pad just next to us. So it's kind of strange. You then get to the obvious ones, which account for, I think, around about 120, 130 of the stations are actually at airport facilities. some of them are pretty good. You know, they don't have to be bad just because they're at an airport, and they're essential things. The thing I would say about some of them is I did one report called An Internationally Agreed Distance from the Runway, which is basically the Met Office claim that there is, or claimed on their website, that there is this internationally agreed distance from the runway. So I wrote to them and said, can you please explain to me what this internationally agreed distance from the runway is? Well, of course, there isn't such a thing. You know, it's just a weasel. I actually put it as weasel words. It's just nonsense. There is no international, there's no such metric. It doesn't exist. All this, it's just the CMO regulations, but they called it an internationally agreed distance from the runway. Why? You know, it's just daft. Some of the sites, there's the famous one in Aberdeen Airport, which is called DICE, D-Y-C-E, DICE Airport. The Met Office's head office is in Exeter, which is right in the southwest of England. But they do have an office in Scotland, and it's an Aberdeen Airport in DICE. You can walk from their offices to DICE weather station in about 5 minutes. Okay. If you haven't seen the picture, it's on Google. It's the latest aerial image of the site, and you've got, and I think it's an Airbus A320 engine just pointing straight at the thing with jet blast screens around the. Why would you want to have a screen like that where you've got to have jet blast protection for it to even not get blown away, sort of thing? And on a few of my reports, I do put in videos there too. Jet blast, particularly in relation to Coningsby, which I'll come to in a minute. But lots of these sites are very close to either the runways or the taxiways. On one, I think it was Herne Airport, in the aerial picture from Google, there's something like 40 aircraft queuing to go past this thing. St Athan is another one that's near Cardiff in South Wales. Exactly the same thing. The aircraft have to come off the runway and they have to go past this screen. Powered, of course. Their engines are running on, maybe only running on low power, but they're going to be chucking out something. And you go past them. Let me just try and see if I can my notes here. Yeah. So you've got these sort of things. And you've also got the joke that is called Heathrow Airport weather station, which is, I've done one sort of a reference of a report. It's classed as class 3. And yet there's Lucas Airport in Scotland, which is classed as class 5, which is infinitely better. You know, they stand by Heathrow as being better than it actually is, because I don't think they want to admit that it's an absolutely atrocious site, and you couldn't take but it regularly gives you the highest reading of the day, and people think, oh, that's wonderful, that's okay. It's absolute nonsense, but what can you do? That's just the way it is. But to give you a real example of some of the things that go on, I did a review, one of the early ones, of a place called Harden. That's Hawarden, Harden Airport, which is in North Wales on the border with England. And it holds the Welsh national record. Okay, airports hold nearly all the records, in fact. When I was looking at it, the Surface Stations project on Talk Shop actually started in about 2012. Tim Shannon, the guy who did it, sadly has passed away. He wasn't well then, apparently. And he'd done a review of Harden, and I couldn't understand where he was coming from, the levels that he was saying. And it took me ages. I just couldn't figure it out. And I realized they've moved it about 100 meters. Okay. They moved it from a reasonably good site to right on a junction where the aircraft have to go past. They did that subsequent to 2012 when he was doing his reviews. They've actually moved it to get the record because they hadn't been able to break the record in Wales since about 1990. And records have been falling down for England and Scotland several times since then. So it appears that they actually moved the station. There's no other reason to have relocated it. It's not as if anything was built around it or it wasn't serving its function. They literally moved it 100 meters to a junction where aircraft or vehicle, emergency service, whatever, have to go past it. And there's an awful lot of hard standing. And it's just crazy. You know, it looks a deliberate effort. we got the record in the UK ever was in 2022. Now, this is the notorious one about Coningsby, which is where the jet aircraft take off. I actually got a video clip that I put on my report on there, which shows 3 Typhoon jets doing a performance takeoff, where they literally go up vertically, and you can just see that the heat haze just blasted out of the screens. Did you? I don't know if you know. Have you looked at any of my reports at all?
I looked at some on Tall Blokes, but
Okay.
you're coming out with them almost every day or enormous number?
Oh yeah.
I've looked at some. Yeah.
Yeah. I started doing them August last year, and I'm about 193, I think, since then. So I'm about a day and a half. It takes me, although I'm knocking them out of one a day, I started this sort of like 2-3 years ago, getting information together. So a lot of it I've already done, but it still takes about 2 or 3 hours a day just to knock it together. And then other days I'll be doing other research and that sort of thing to keep the thing going forward. I mean, I could probably write 3 or 4 just like that from the information I've got, but it just takes, and I don't want to swamp anything. I'm not in that much of a rush. I've got a life to do with other things as well. But one of the things I was going to say is there's a report on there about Waddington. This is very, very worrying because Waddington is RAF Waddington is also near Coningsby. What I discovered in there is that when I was looking at these stations that don't exist, I have it in writing from the Met Office that they do not attribute data from one site to another, right? And yet, as soon as I looked up Waddington, I looked up the notes, and it said data from Scampton transferred over. So they actually, it's their own admission, they've moved data from RAF Scampton and put it on RAF Waddington because the system was out of action for about 3 years. They were just transferring all the data over, which is quite remarkable. However, one thing they've done is that if you now look on the 19th of July, 2022, they've transferred over Coningsby's details as well. Now, I'm having quite an argument with them about this at the moment. It didn't register that temperature, but they put it there in the records. 10 years' time, the student's going around and look at it. Well, what's the query about Coningsby? Because it was that temperature there as well. I don't know. You wouldn't play. Why are you playing fast and loose with the record of 40.3? If it had actually been there on that day, they would have heralded it. They would have spoken about it. And if anybody like Chris Morrison, who was the chap I know you've interviewed before, had said, the 3 Typhoon jets taking off, that isn't right. Well, so they would just simply say, well, it happened at RAF Waddington as well, But of course it didn't. They tried to claim to me that an article they put out, which said that it was actually 39.9 at that point. They said, "Oh, well, I've misread the map. Apparently, it just goes on and on and on like that." So yeah, we've got lots and lots of aircraft, aviation, heliport type sites, which are just simply really not what you would want for the purposes of the exercise. In reviewing the site, you also get to see what the Met Office does with its information, or misinformation, as you might like to think. I've spoken about the climate averages. When I took them to task about that, got the Freedom of Information Effect, I think the open and closed stations, they said, we don't attribute data, and here's this peer-reviewed system that we use of averaging and compiling the data. So they said it's a peer-reviewed process. I said, fine. So let me pin you down on this then. Folks and over 2 sites. You tell me which other sites you use to compile that data. That's a fairly reasonable question, isn't it? And if it's peer-reviewed science, there's got to be transparency. You've got to be able to prove that point, I would have thought. They couldn't tell me. Now, if you can't say to somebody the data that you used, well, it's fiction, isn't it? If you can't prove it, you can make any claim you like to whatever peer review you want. So what? If you can't produce the data, so my attitude is, well, I simply don't believe you then. If you can't say you can't do that, then you can't do that. And this is an issue you're finding in lots and lots of places. One particular site, they have, the Met Office has a page historic station data. It has a map. And on the map, it conveniently shows you open and closed sites. And there's a site called Lowestoft. It's in the east of England. And the thing about it is, it says it's an open site, i.e. it's working. So I said to them, can you tell me where it is? And they sent me back, well, this is what its data is. I said, no, can you tell me where it is? And then they said to me, oh, well, it's not there. So they're saying it's an open site, subsequently found it closed in 2010. But they're not putting this on the climate averages page. They're actually reporting monthly data as if this site exists. Yeah, they've been doing this for the last 15 years. Worse still, they moved it, whatever, sometime, quite a long way from one place to another, and just seamlessly bonded the whole data set together. And then that site, which doesn't exist, is then is having averages made up from somewhere else, but given as monthly figures, is then going into a cell with others, none of which exist, as I said to you earlier, to compile this sort of area climate average out of complete nonsense. And again, I'm taken to task with that as to which stations they've actually used to compile the figures. If there's none there, how the hell can you use anybody's figures? It's crazy. The other thing they tend to do is, which I think is a complete no-no, and I wrote it up with a site in Southampton called Mayflower Park. Southampton Mayflower Park had, you won't know too much, I wouldn't have thought about UK weather, but in 1976, a long time ago, we had the most fantastic summer on record. It was the hottest summer in the Central England temperature record series of all, I believe. It may have been a hotter one a couple of 100 years ago or something, but it was very, very hot for a very long period. And Southampton Mayflower Park held the record for the highest June temperature ever in the UK, and it still holds it to this day. I did this report as if you were a modern student, an 18-year-old just about to start going to university, to inquire about the data of Southampton Mayflower Park, what you would find out if you did, bearing in mind that not only were you not born when this record occurred, your parents probably weren't born either, right? Because it's back in 1976. You know, you're talking however many. I was 20 then, so 53 years ago. No, sorry, I'm getting it wrong. Anyway, a long time ago. I went into, if you read the thing, I went into AI and said, tell me about Southampton Mayflower Park. And it says, oh, it's a weather station in Southampton and blah, 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 blah. So any student who would be looking at that now would think it's an active weather station because AI told them, so why would you want to start querying it? You can then go to the historic station data page of the Met Office, which it does direct you to, and it shows this continuous average for the last 60 years, from 1960 to 2020, from the data. But it's all made up. The station closed 25 years ago, but there is nothing for you to show you that. There's nothing there to tell you that it doesn't exist. It looks as if it's a bona fide weather station. And if you were a young student in any sort of climate science, if you want to call it, as that is the subject, but any of those related areas, why would you query it? Because you're getting the data straight from the horse's mouth. It is the Met Office. Why wouldn't you believe it? Even though when you actually dig in deep, you can see that most of it is basically fiction. They haven't told you that they've moved it from a park in one side of Southampton. I put a map in there with a little line, moved it somewhere else, just continued with the same data set. They haven't told you they've moved it, and then just carried on making up numbers after it closed. It came to the classic one with Stornoway Airport, which they show records for Stornoway Airport from before aircraft were even invented, whereas in actual fact it was in a completely different location in a castle grounds, however many kilometres away. I did show it on the map and then work it out. But again, you don't know that. So you assume it's not shown, it's not visible. And that happens an awful lot. Braemar is a classic one where they moved the station, they called it from Braemar to Braemar number 2, but they still bonded on the records for that. There's one in northwest, east coast of England called Whitby, where there are actually 2 stations operating simultaneously. and they just transferred one figure to another one and just carried the same file going, even though one was right on the headland on the coast and the other one's in a park, a couple of miles away. This is quite a common thing to do. So it gives you the impression of a continuously warming situation. If you massage figures in the way that they're doing, you can get any result you ever wanted to produce. And it really is that simple. So we've done the phony sites. We've done the thing. Right, here's a weird one for you. Rural sites and UHI, okay? 150 years ago in Kent, the county in the southeast of England where I live, there were 12 official Met Office weather stations. So that's 150 years ago, there were 12. 100 years ago, that number had risen to 18. 50 years ago, that number had risen to 32. Now there's 7, right? So it's been a continuous rise because weather stations are getting cheaper, the equipment's easier, all the rest of it. 50 years ago, there were 32. Now there's only 7. The argument being that they automated a lot of these sites. Most of them then, somebody would go along, read the thermometer 9 o'clock in the morning, give out the figure. They've subsequently automated them, but of course that needs an electricity supply and it needs data communications, which in 1970 would have been a landline and probably a mains electricity connection. So progressively, they've closed them down, and you've just rendered the ones that can remain have been all in urban areas or near to urban areas at the time, which have then been engulfed by urban areas. So I know that lots of people have done studies on that, but it is quite an important point to note. Now, I'd like to just try and get everybody to envisage this. There's a clock face here, yeah? And right in the middle of that clock face is central London, yeah? The centre part of London is around about St James's Park and Mall, which leads up to Buckingham Palace. So if you take that circle there and you take a 12 o'clock, you take a circle from 12 o'clock to 4 o'clock. Yeah, that's a quadrant there, a little bit there. There's one weather station, and that's in Epping Forest. Forest clearing is hopelessly, it's class 5, it's terrible. If you go from 4 o'clock round to 8 o'clock, there's one weather station, right? Kenley Airfield, it's an aviation field. If you go from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock, there's 11, right? And then there's one more if you go all the way back to the top. Of the 14 in the Met Office say that stations should be around about 40 kilometres apart. If you're in that 40-kilometre radius from the centre of London, there's 14. But 11 of them are in one tiny little quadrant, which is to the west of London. So in England, when we get warm weather, it tends to come from the continent or even from North Africa. So you've got a easterly round to southerly winds coming over, very short sea crossing over the English Channel, which is only 25 miles at its narrowest, all over Kent, straight onto London, and all your receivers are on the far end of it, where all the warm air from London has wafted over. You're going to get very much enhanced UHI just by blowing the air straight onto the likes of Heathrow Airport, RAF, Northolt. The one with the substation is actually there as well. So you're actually distorting the readings quite deliberately so. And the distribution that's being left of weather stations in the UK does have this incredible tendency to being warmer areas, and where they're even being added. The county of Devon, where the Met Office has its main head office, has more weather stations per square metre than anywhere outside London, square mile rather, than anywhere outside London. And they keep adding to them. It's whereas everywhere else is losing. If you go up to a cold part of the country, which would be the northeast coast, a classic example is Fife, where they keep closing. They've only got 3 that are left there now in the whole county, whereas there's like 17 or 19, actually, I think it is in Devon, vastly more concentrated. And it's that sort of slight distortion, shall we say, that seems to be going on with the area representation, which is, again, is another thing that the project is looking at. Right. I just want to check, have I covered, I've done all the phony sites. We've done that. We've done a bit about West London. A couple of other things, silly little ones, that there used to be a weather station. I think it's Anthony Watts used to say that weather stations were drawn to air conditioning units, sort of thing. There's a station that I went to myself some time ago on a completely irrelevant business. It's called Gravesend. Well, rather, the Met Office called it Gravesend. It wasn't in Gravesend. It's just a weird name that they gave it. It's actually in a place called Broadness. And for some inexplicable reason, they decided to put a weather station in the compound of a huge mast transmitter in it and the computing equipment for the Thames radar station, which has, on every face of it, has these big aircon units to keep the equipment cool. And I went in there with a colleague on other business, not knowing anything. And the first thing you felt when you walked into the compound was this waft of warm air. I don't know if you know, slightly overloaded electrics have got sort of a fishy smell to them, and it sort of struck you as soon as you walked in there. After we'd done the business that we needed to do, we went round to leave, and the colleague was this, what a dumb place to put a weather station. I hadn't even noticed it. And as we stood there, you could actually feel the warm breeze coming off this air conditioning, just wafting it. Unsurprisingly, this weather station at Gravesend used to record the hottest temperature in the UK on a regular basis. It still has the hottest record for the hottest October day, but it used to every day say, oh, it was so many degrees in Gravesend today. And you think, what, you're being serious? You know, eventually, I think everybody twigged that it was kind of stupid. And if you read the report I did in there, even the Met Office spokesman said, yeah, well, it was only a few degrees out, a few tenths of a degree out. Well, that's kind of silly, you know. I think one other point I'd like to go to mention about temperatures and that sort of thing. One particular site is a site in East Anglia called Cavendish, and it recorded the hottest temperature of the day. And I thought, I know something about Cavendish. I had a friend who lived in Cavendish. So I rang him up and said, and what was it about the temperature yesterday? It was supposedly the hottest, you were the hottest in the country. And he said, oh, yeah, well, there were combine in the fields. And where the weather station is in someone's back garden. And the combine harvesters go up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down. And they regularly turn right where this weather station is in someone's back garden. So I thought, no, you're joking me, aren't you? And so I said, okay. I wrote to the contacted the Met Office by email and said, can you tell me when this reading occurred at Cavendish? And they sent me back this absolutely incredible reply. They gave me the readings to the 5th decimal point of a degree centigrade, right? They believe that they can read the temperature to 100,000th of a degree. So I emailed them back and I said, look, I don't think you can. Are you happy to stand by that you are actually recording to the 5th decimal place? I think I was in a bit of a sarcastic mood because I pointed out to them that Usain Bolt ran the 100 meters in 9.56 seconds or whatever it was for the world record, and 100,000th of 100 meters is a millimeter. You know, do you really think you can take a whole degree centigrade and cut it down that small and record it out in the field? And they said, yeah. So I published it. So I actually published the set of the figures. I just couldn't, you know, reason and logic seems to go out of the window and you get these crazy, okay, I give up on it. I think, I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I think I'm pretty much done covering all the points. The only last thing that I would like to say is that, yeah, there's a couple of points if I can add. One is about scales. We talked about, I said I do everything in Celsius. In the past, up until 1961, everything in the UK was done in Fahrenheit. When they converted those over, 1 degree Fahrenheit is 0.55 of a degree Celsius. And they only used to, in most stations, read to the nearest degree Fahrenheit. It's quite a small unit when you think about it. And parallax errors, when you're trying to read anything, If you get your eye line slightly wrong, you'll get a wrong reading. So they only ever used to go to a whole degree Fahrenheit, or some did go to half a degree, and apparently it was even trialed to go to a 1/10 of a degree Fahrenheit, but it was viewed that was beyond the capabilities. But when you're converting from Fahrenheit to centigrade, because it's 0.55 degree, you hit that wonderful rounding thing that the Met Office does, or a lot of people do, is that a 0.5 gets rounded up. Yeah. So 32 degrees Fahrenheit is obviously 0. 33 degrees becomes 0.6 because they take the 0.55 and round it to 0.6, whereas 34 becomes 1.1 because t times 0.55. It may seem quirky, but what do you call 31 degrees Fahrenheit? It's minus 0.55. Now, how do you round that? Do you round to 0.5 or do you round to 0.6? They actually round to 0.6. So 31 Fahrenheit to 33 is actually 1.2 degrees Celsius, which it isn't. It's 1.1 at any other point in the scale. So you get this really crazy, jerky sort of averaging that goes on. And the last thing about that is also the fact of the instrumentation. Even stations now in the UK that report manually, they've changed from a liquid in glass thermometer that you just read by looking at the scale to a platinum resistance thermometer, which you just look at the number and write it down. It takes away the skill element. The critically important thing about a PRT, you can test it for yourself. You just get yourself a little, if you get any sort of instant readout thermometer, you can just breathe on it and immediately the temperature will change. Whereas if you take a thermometer, a standard liquid in glass thermometer, to take your body temperature, for instance, you would put it in your mouth and you would leave it there for a minute because they don't respond very quickly. And of course, you've got this crazy situation now where an aircraft can take off. It's a tiny little pulse. It lasts for a few seconds, but it will be picked up by modern instrumentation that wouldn't have picked it up before. So you've got a level of distortion there as well. That's about as far as I've got so far. I hope I haven't bored you to tears with all that.
No, this is fantastic. This is gold. I love this content. So thank you. I do have a few questions if you have a little time.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I've got all the time in the world.
So did you say that the assumption is that it's a class 1 unless proven otherwise, kind of?
Oh, yeah. Of course I can talk about that. Yeah. Right. Do you want me to go on about that? Yeah.
Yeah. Let's hear about it.
Yeah. Okay. I'd just like to go back on this thing then about classifications, in that there is a default position on all their systems of class 1 and excellent, which is their own individual thing. So unless it's manually altered downwards, it gets recorded as the best it can possibly be. When I originally got the CMO listings, I saw one there, Hastings, and I thought, hang on a minute, I know that place. I've been there. So I went down there and had a look. I challenged them on that and said, that's not class 1. You can't possibly call that class 1. And I got a very nice email back then saying, yeah, we're terribly sorry about that. It's a human error. It should have been class 4. A little while later, I looked at another one in Scotland, which I couldn't actually visit because it's too far away, called Castley. Castley's quite interesting. I said, are you sure that is class 1? And it's not a default error, because it's got the entirety of the Lokshin hydroelectric power station in the 100-meter zone. And it does. And it's on an incredible slope. That point, when I queried that, they said, I would like to give you a video conference to discuss all these issues you keep raising. I said, bring it on. I'll be available on these dates. Is it okay with you? And then out of the blue, they said, we're not going to talk to you. And they literally declined. So they'd offered this video conference and said, no chance, stop it. This is class 1. Now, they didn't actually say Castley was class 1. They said, our assessment of it is correct. Right? So they didn't say, they just said our assessment, didn't say it wasn't class 1. This really got annoying. It got me very annoyed. So I actually thought, well, I'll check another one out, which is a place called Edenbridge. And again, this time I thought, you're not going to get away with this one. So I actually went there, made sure I had actual photographs and a little video clip. And then after a bit of to and fro, again, exactly the same thing. They came back and said, oh, yes, it's class 4. It must be one of our errors. I do wonder how many of these are out there are actually classification errors. And when they say they're class 1, they're probably not class 1. We just forgot to do anything about it. Or, as I suspect, in the case of they put a new station at a place called Neatis Head, which is in East Anglia. I couldn't find the CMO because it was relatively new. So I emailed them and said, look, can you please tell me what you've already supplied me with this list under freedom of information, but that one wasn't on it. Can you tell me what it was? And they actually said, no, we will tell you if you tell us why you want to know. I've got that in writing. I put it on the Neatis Head report there. I put it on there verbatim because they wouldn't tell me unless I could give them a reason why I wanted to know, which I thought, well, it's incredible. So I had to go through a freedom of information request on that one. And in that, they sent me the inspection dates. And the inspection date when they cleared the CMO classification was after I'd queried it. They'd never done it. Where do you go with that? You know.
Have you done some research into just using class 1, just pristine class 1 stations? And how long running are those and what do those show?
Right, okay, if I can go into the whole point of the Surface Stations project was there to assess all the existing things. My personal ambition is to finally get down to what is good, what is bad, what you can use, what you can't use. And to be able to prove it, because everybody's going to immediately say, I mean, I get so much flack, you will know what you get, yeah. Sorry, but, people have actually accused me of making up some of these pictures, by the way, that I put on the thing. And I'm thinking, well, it's on Google. Go and look at it yourself, But anyway, I would like to be able to come out at the end and say, right, here's 10, 20, however many it takes. The Central England temperature record only actually operates on 3 at the moment. I don't think it's ever operated on a large number. I figured about 30 for the British Isles. But to be frank, the British Isles is it's the world's 5th largest island, I believe, Great Britain. It's such a long shape that can you really have a climate for such a diverse area as Scotland down to southwest England or southeast England? I don't think you really can. So I was kind of hoping to emulate something like the Central England temperature record and do maybe just England, Wales, Scotland is a separate issue, and the whole island of Ireland is a completely separate case altogether, really. And I have tended to avoid so far doing too many reviews on Northern Ireland because they really don't hold too much similarity to, for instance, where I live in England in the southeast, which is nice and warm, very dry. Where I live, the water company keeps sending us out posts, leaflets saying we get less rain than some parts of Saudi Arabia, Whereas if you go up to the northwest of Scotland, for instance, it will literally get 10 times the amount of rain that we get. It's completely, you can't really compare those sort of climates over that range. So yes, ultimately, I want to find a number of really good sites with a long record, which, as I said, is difficult to get out of the Met Office, but that's what I'm working to achieve in the end. Whew.
Let's say you had a theoretical class 1 site that was downwind of the UHI, of the urban heat island of London. Yep. So that still would be contaminated by the London heat island?
Right. I personally don't hold that much. I could be wrong. I'm not that much of an expert. But I think this comes to a point where you've got to say, you've got to have a reasonable approach. There's one particular station called Rothamsted, which is in the Central England temperature record, and it's run by a research organisation called Rothamsted Research. They are excellent. They are top hole. For them, most of these agricultural research centres, and there's a lot of weather stations, are very good because they're not trying to play to any agenda. They just need the real figures, so you can trust them. I recall when you interviewed Chris Morrison, he made a point there about one of the things I did about Kaywood. That's C-A-W, by the way, O-O-D, Kaywood. Again, that's a Scantex research centre, and it's class 1, and it's got very good data. It's manually recording as well. and it's done it for a very long time. But if you take Rothamsted, for instance, you could say, well, it's just north of London. How far do you go? I think it would be, you could reasonably assume that if it's more than a few miles away from a big urban area, it should be okay. Don't, you're never going to get perfection, but don't let the aim of it sort of spoil being good, sort of thing. So I would say, yeah, I don't hold too much stead, though how big a UHI effect is, who knows, in certain weather conditions, maybe. Yeah.
So I may have his name wrong. Is there a guy named Peter Nichols that downloaded the data every day and he saw the data from decades ago just kept changing and changing? So do you think this is all massaged even after the stuff you're talking about? The data is still fudged after that?
Right. It's possibly because of the archiving system that we use here, right? They've converted the handwritten records into a digital archive. You can have access to the original you can have sight of the original handwritten ones. Even online, they've been photocopied, so you can see them. Averages and representations subsequently thereof, maybe, but you can still access the raw numbers, which is what I think you would have to work from. Yeah, you can't just trust somebody else's averaging, particularly not the way they do averages. I did put on there a note from a guy called Stephen Connolly. He did a superb review. I don't know if you read that one, on comparing temperatures past and present, and it's really worth to read. I didn't write it; he wrote it. I have full credit to him because he used what's it called, a Bugatti car, not Chiron, I can't remember. He quoted a great analogy of a super fast car and how you could go through a tunnel and average out the speed by just going really fast, really slow, really fast, really slow. And you could come up with a corrupted average. And he then compared that to a station that the Met Éireann did, the Republic of Ireland, who seem to have a much better weather agency than we do. And he compared using averages taken every hour for 60 years manually. And they never missed, or I think they missed 4 in apparently 60 years. And it averaged that out using different methods of averaging. Rather than using Tmax, Tmin, and divided by 2, he used a more sophisticated average, and he come up with completely different figures. So I would never trust anybody else's interpretation of an average, because you can just do that any way you like that way. You've got to go back to your original raw numbers and start again. And you can verify those by sight of the, in the past, the manual written forms. Obviously, the more recent stuff, it's a good point. I'd have to check into, but I'm more concerned. One of the things you did on one of your videos was about recent on guerrilla science, showed that temperatures in the 1930s, being that terrific spike in the States, where it was much hotter back then. It's noticeable that the Met Office over here only run their climate averages from 1960 for general public viewing. You can't go back to they will have that in sort of sophisticated things, but that will have been so juggled about with mathematically by climate scientists that you can't really trust that sort of data at all. But yeah, it's going to be the thing that we come into here is the burden of proof. It's easy to make up and say, yeah, this is good, that's good. You've got to prove it, and I'm under the obligation to prove it just as much as the Met Office is under the obligation if I'm going to try and claim it any other way. Quite a number of people, and it's just to remind me one thing I will tell you at the end, have assisted me with all this. And there's people with far better computing abilities and statistical powers than I have who are assisting with that. And hopefully between us all, we will be able to get something together that we can prove. One last little thing that might interest you, and it's just going off on a little tangent. You don't have to include this if you want, if you don't want to, but your body might be interested in this if he doesn't already know. In the south, very close to where I live. Have you ever heard of a guy called Stuart Dimmock?
Sounds familiar. Don't know though.
Don't know. Right. He was a governor at a local school, and he discovered that his daughter was being taught very dodgy climate science, and they were all being shown the inconvenient truth. So he thought he'd take the education authorities to court about this because he thought that was giving a biased impression and some of the data was wrong. He, in conjunction with, so he's local to me, though I don't know him, in conjunction with another local authority councillor over in the west of New Forest area called Derek Tipp, they took the government to court and said, you can't do this. And the judges largely agreed. And so a DVD of The Great Global Warming Swindle by Martin Durkin was sent out to every school in the country as a counter to an inconvenient truth. Whether or not they showed it is another matter. When I started on this project, people, I have given out my own personal email address to lots of people. And I do advertise it in places. I don't mind because I want people to contribute if they possibly can. And lots of people have helped me in lots of ways. It's very good. But right at the beginning and through it, this one guy was very, very supportive and very, very helpful. And particularly when I started, when I wasn't sure if anybody was actually reading anything I was doing, it was just a nice guy and he gave me a lot of support. When I came across this thing about Stuart Demick and the thing, I suddenly realised the guy who was sending me all the support was Derek Tipp. He was one of the two people who took the government to court. He never ever mentioned it to me, but he was just feeding me lots and lots of help, and it was really nice to know, actually. So, yeah, and I really do think I've covered everything now.
Yeah, I think it's so important that all of these ordinary people are pushing back against this thing. I totally love it. I do have one additional question. I don't know if you want to answer it, but what do you think the mixture is between incompetence and kind of fraud in terms of what these people are doing to produce these or to sell us this ridiculous data? What do you think?
Right. Okay. Now, that really is a very serious question. Do I know that most meteorologists out there are decent people doing a good job. Got to be careful what I say. Okay. I'm getting fed information by certain people. Okay. And I'm not going to divulge who they are. It just simply can't. Right. Okay. And it transpires that even within the organizations, there is distrust going on, shall we say. Yeah, I can believe that there's a lot of people are not as competent as they really should be. But they're probably only like a customer-facing service rep who tells me that they can read to the fifth decimal place of a degree or something like that. But I do genuinely believe that there is only a small number of people who are influencing. Why would in 2019 you decide that a Victorian walled kitchen garden was a good place to start adding data from? Because Kingston Moorwood, that's when they started using its data from. Why would you do that? It's not right. There's a place called Inverurie in Scotland. The weather station's been there for a while. It's outside of the walled garden, but it's a bit overgrown. It's run by the National Trust of Scotland. They run all the site. They've got all the machinery necessary, but they said, well, the station's a bit overgrown now. They can't cut it back, give over. They're going to move the station into the walled garden. And that's got to be sanctioned by the Met Office to do that relocation. Same as the Harden Airport relocation of the site. That I can't accept is an accident. So whether or not it's deliberate, it's difficult to attribute cause if you can't prove anything. I'm very suspicious that there's a small cabal of people within the organizations who are manipulating data and sites. That's as categorical as I feel I can be and get away with it.
I think it could be like anything else with just 1% of the people being bad apples or fraudsters.
Yeah.
Or the same with counting votes. If 1% of the precincts have massive fraud, or even in this case, it could be that 99% of the people are fine, but there's some bad apples mixed in. That's what I think. One other question, my last question here is, do you have any sense that just the UK data is screwed up and everywhere else in the world, their data is good? Or do you think this extends beyond?
No. What I've found in the meteorological terms is that the UK Met Office, you guys over there, and I can't remember what they call it, is it the NOA or whatever it is, NOIA, is it? Yep. For the Southern Hemisphere, the BOM, Bureau of Meteorology in Australia. Those three things seem to dominate everything, and nobody else really seems to get much of a look in. So all the final data that is produced and analysed seems to be in some way controlled by those three authorities. I watched your Gross Science on the BBC the other day, and it was quite surprising how large and how an organisation it actually is, and how it's gone global and seems to control things. If you look on some of the Met Office websites, you see their stations. They've got the whole globe is covered with them. You know, why we've got stations all around the globe, I don't really know, but we do, and they seem to be the Australian authorities, us and yours, seem to dominate the whole picture. When I said about Met Éireann, they seem to be, because they're Irish and they don't, and they got the good sense to ignore what we say to them anymore. You know, they seem to be okay. But when you look around other authorities, I'm actually half Italian, believe it or not. If you look at, I don't know, I'm so handsome, but if you look at the Italian authority, it's run by the Air Force, right? And all they care about are just Air Force bases, really. There's a separate system that's run by the agricultural bodies. Nothing is as dominant as the Met Office. Is it NOAA you call it, or the organisation, the US?
Yeah, NOAA, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's them, us, and the BOM seem to run everything as far as I can make out. And the WMO seems just to be, well, they're just part of the UN anyway, aren't they? So you can't really trust anything that comes out of that. So yeah, that's all. I haven't got a lot of experience, but the one that, when I compared the Met Office with, say, the Italian Air Force system, they're just not even comparative at all. It's a completely different ball game. They're not as interested in the same way.
Okay, I think we're probably ready to wrap up here, but thanks a ton for all you're doing. Do you have any last thing you want to say? Now is the time.
No,
to do
that's
it?
fine.
Okay.
That's fine. Thanks for putting up with me.
No, excellent stuff. So thank you for what you're doing. I hope to have you on again sometime. Ray Sanders.
Okay,
Talk to you
love it.
later. Yeah, bye.
Cheers. Bye.